I invite you to turn over with me to Joshua chapter 2. Last week we kind of had a shift in our series of lessons of studying through the Bible, and we began looking at the character of Joshua, and that's going to be our agenda for the next few weeks or months. Not only looking at Joshua, of course, but when you look at some of those stories that surround him, you're also looking at other biblical characters along with it. And this morning that's going to be the case as we talk about Joshua chapter 2 and study it. And we're reading about the conquering of the city of Jericho. The conquering of the city of Jericho in and of itself is a very interesting story. To me, it's kind of tucked in the middle of this conquest of Israel to go in and to drive out the Canaanites and to inherit the promised land. But one of the most interesting characters to me in this story is a prostitute by the name of Rahab. We know kind of the background behind the study itself, and since we don't have time to read through all these verses in these chapters, I'm just going to briefly summarize some of the things that are going on here and then talk a little bit about what we can learn from that. But Joshua is needing some kind of final military intelligence about the city of Jericho. And so he sends out two men to go into the city and to spy it out. And surprisingly to us, probably, these two men find refuge in the house of a prostitute named Rahab. Now, to us, that would probably seem like a strange place for a follower of God to wind up. But understand that because of the times and the military strategy and the things that were going on here, it was a good place for these men to get to because it was probably one of the most unsuspecting places in the city itself. You know, the officials would have been used to strangers going in and out of this place, and they probably thought, well, they'll not even think twice about it. Probably would have been also a good place for them to have gathered some information just in conversation about some of the strategic fortified places of the city of Jericho itself. Well, unbeknownst to them, the king of Jericho had men who were watching very closely. They saw these two men enter into the city. They saw them go to the establishment of Rahab. And so this king of Jericho immediately sends some of his servants and his officers out to Rahab's establishment and basically said, we know these two men have come to this place. Now we want you to produce them. Rahab, probably pointing toward the Jordan River, tells the authorities that the men had left the city under the cover of night. And of course, we read about how as soon as the search party goes out for them, the city of Jericho, the gates of that city are shut up straightly, not letting anybody out or anybody come in. Rahab, though, is fascinated by these Israelites. And so she hides these two men on her rooftop under some stalks of flax. And she goes up to them and she begins having a conversation with them. And in this conversation, she expresses a couple of things. The first thing that she expresses is her fear of the future. In other words, as she's speaking to these men, she says, I know what the future holds. You know, I know what's going to happen. I know you guys are going to come into this place and you're going to drive out all of us and you're going to inherit this land. And she not only heard about probably the rumors of how they were going to do this, but they also heard some of the things that had already happened. Remember now, we're 40 years removed from the plagues of Egypt because Israel had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But these people and these inhabitants are still talking about those things. They say, we know the stories about how you guys came up out of Egypt, about how you were able to cross over the Red Sea. We've just recently heard how you defeated these two powerful Amorite kings, Sihon and Og. And so she says, I know that our future is not bright for us. But she also does another thing. She also recognizes that there were some larger forces at work than just the Israelites themselves. Rahab recognized that this was something that could only come from a divine being, what they were able to do and to accomplish. And so she's recognizing this existence of this divine being and the power that he possesses and the fact that he is fighting for the children of Israel. And so that's kind of the conversation that they have between one another. And after that, Rahab basically begs for her safety and for her life. Those two spies grant that. They probably point to a piece of scarlet material and say, if you hang this in the window, whenever you see us come, then you and any of your family who are in this house will be spared alive. She lowers them in. Remember, the gates of the city are shut because of the positioning of her house. She lives within the wall of the city. She's able to lower these men over the side of the wall and to help them escape out of her window. She tells them, run into the hills, hide for 3 days, wait for those 3 days. When those people are looking for you, come back to the city, then go back to your people. But basically, those spies promised to protect her if she would keep their secret of it, or their visit a secret. They also, of course, warned her, if you don't keep this a secret, we're not bound to keep our oath anymore, too. And it's just, to me, again, as a student of God's Word, it's one of those fascinating stories in the Bible. Probably most, if not all of us, are familiar with it. But what I want to talk about this morning is probably one of the most fascinating parts of this story to me. And that is how God used, not a Jew, not a what we would consider a faithful follower of God from among His people, but how God used a Gentile woman who was very questionable, at least in character, to accomplish His will. And what I want us to really get from this lesson today, and it's a lesson that reoccurs throughout the Bible. It's not a new one. None of them are that we usually study. But it's a lesson to me that I really take to heart, because it's this lesson how God has a way of working and using just ordinary people in the most unlikely of people to really work out and accomplish His will. And as a human being, what I want us to think of, the sermon is entitled this, Why God Shouldn't Have Used Rahab. And I don't want you to get the impression that I'm questioning God in any way, because I'm not. But I want us to think about it from the standpoint this morning of how we as humans and individuals view Rahab, and how our viewpoint and our thinking about this woman would probably be a lot different than how God thought about her and what God did with her. And so we want to talk about that, and then, of course, point out some applications of that this morning. I have here this morning 4 things that I want us to think about as the reasons why God shouldn't have used Rahab. The first one I made mention of is, it's just simply the fact that Rahab was a Canaanite. She was not a Jew. And of course, by that, I simply mean she was not a descendant of Abraham. She was not one of those to whom God had made this special promise about inheriting a land and about making of her a great nation and about bringing the Christ through her. She was not of the lineage or the descendants of Abraham at all. And when you read through the Bible, it's no secret that because God chose the Jews, that nation and that race, to do something special and to accomplish His purpose, there was always this sense of superiority that a lot of them felt over other nations. And I also want to emphasize it wasn't really just them that felt that the Jews had this sense of superiority over every other nation and race. It was a lot of other people, too, outside that. I'm amazed, even today, within America, that idea is still ingrained in the minds of some individuals that somehow the Jews are a superior race and a nation above every other race and nation of people upon the earth. Now, what I do want to emphasize is God did choose the Jews. He did choose the descendants of Abraham, and He did choose this people in this nation to do something very special for Him, and that was to bring the Christ into the world. But what I also want us to kind of digest and chew upon this morning is they were not the one and the only race in the nation, and the only race and the only nation that mattered to God. There were other followers of God out here in other nations. There were other followers of God out here among other races. And that's, you kind of see that briefly reflected in points in the history of God recording what the children of Israel did. But again, I want to emphasize just kind of what the viewpoint of a Jew would have been toward Rahab in that day and age. You know, I think Jesus, in His day and age, in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 17, He kind of gave us a picture, an indication of that
relationship or that feeling between a Jew and a non-Jew. And he actually was talking to his own disciples about church discipline, about what to do with a brother or sister. You know, once the error of their way has been pointed out to them, once you have tried to reconcile them to Christ and they would not listen. He says there in verse 17, he said, if ye shall neglect to hear them, the 2 or 3 witnesses, tell it unto the church. But if ye neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man, and as a publican. Well, how did the Jew think about and how did they treat a heathen person? A person who was outside, some versions translated a Gentile, because that's how they viewed a heathen individual. But a person who was outside the Jewish race and the Jewish nation. Well, they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't want to associate with them. They didn't even want to touch something that they had touched, because they would believe they'd be unclean if they did that. And so you have this mindset of how God's people, how God's chosen race viewed other individuals in that day and age. And so as people are looking at this situation, the question becomes, why would God use a Canaanite? Why wouldn't he use a Jew? Why wouldn't he use a descendant of Abraham to accomplish his will at this point and this time? It's not just because she was not a descendant of Abraham that God used her. But the point that I want to really emphasize is you didn't have, even in that day and age, you didn't have to be a descendant of Abraham to have God's approval or to say that God could use you or not. Now, if you were a Jew, that's a little bit different discussion, but I'm talking about those outside of that nation or race. What does that mean for us today? Well, I don't know about you, but for me, that's good news. Because I'm not a Jew. I didn't descend from a Jew. I'm not a descendant of Abraham in any way. And what that indicates to me today, that doesn't mean that I'm out of the loop. Doesn't mean that I'm not useful for God. Doesn't mean that he can't use me to accomplish his purposes and work out his will in this life. In fact, what the Bible indicates to us, and what Paul would write in Romans 4 and verse 12, is that Abraham is not just a father of a physical race, but he's also the father of a spiritual race. People who have the faith of Abraham, Abraham was their spiritual father, so to speak. And so we are the children of Abraham today. Those of us who have the faith of Abraham, we are descendants of Abraham. Not in a physical way like the Jews, but in a spiritual way, in the sense that we possess the same faith, that saving faith that he had. And so one of the reasons I can see as to why God shouldn't have used Rahab from our standpoint would be because she was a Canaanite and not a Jew. The second reason that I want to talk about this morning is probably not one that would really, impact our society as much today as it would have back then. And that point is simply this: Rahab was a woman and not a man. And I don't need you guys this morning, you guys don't need me to go through the Bible and show you the history of mankind and society's viewpoint of women over the years. I think as we read through the Bible, we can kind of get a pretty good grasp of exactly how women were viewed, especially in this day, in this age that we're reading about here in Joshua chapter 2. The Jewish mindset. What was the Jews' attitude toward women? Well, whether you like it or not, history tells us, and even some of the Jews still do this today, the Jewish people, the men, had a daily prayer that they uttered. And that prayer began with this statement: "Dear God, I thank you that I was not born as a woman." So that kind of gives you an indication as to how they viewed women and their value, their worth in that day and in that age. And again, it's an attitude that has been demonstrated through multiple societies, through different ways throughout the centuries of men. And basically, what is that view? Well, it's the view that a woman should not have equal rights as a man has. It's the view that we might say in our society that if a woman does an equal job that a man does, she should receive equal pay. And that's kind of the viewpoint that some societies have had of women over the years. They view women as, we might say, a second-class citizen. in many parts of the world. Again, it's not necessarily that way in our society today, but still in many parts of the world today, women do not have the right to vote. They are considered objects to be owned by males. And in fact, it's just a well-known fact, whether you like it or not, but female babies across the world are more subject to infanticide than male babies are. This is the reality. And what does all that indicate? It indicates that a lot of people view the value or the worth of a woman as not being that on the same plane as a man. Now, I've said it before, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, but what I learned from this, or one of the things that I learned from this story, is God values women just as much as He values men. When you go back to the beginning in Genesis 1 and verse 27, when the Bible tells us about God creating the male and the female, we were both created in the image of God. And so there is an equality when it comes to who we are and to what we're worth in the sight of God. Woman is not a second-class citizen to man. Both of us were made in the image of God. Both of us were valuable, made valuable in the sight of God. I think where some people get the ideas a little bit, or the waters become a little bit muddy for some people today, is this. That does not mean that God doesn't have different roles for us. In other words, that doesn't mean that God didn't create men and women to do different things and to have different works for them to accomplish. It does mean this, though. While we may not have the same role, the same objectives, and the same jobs that God has given to us, we are both valuable in the sight of God. God does not value a man over a woman. God does not value a woman over a man. God sees them in equality when He looks at one of them. And so Christianity, listen, well, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. When Christianity came along in the first century, it brought some worth and value. Well, maybe I should say it reestablished some worth and some value to women that had been assigned to them by God. And while many people in that day and age of Joshua chapter 2 would have looked at God using a woman as being something negative, it was not something that God viewed as being negative. And so He was not ashamed to use this woman to accomplish His will and His purpose. The third thing that I want us to think about this morning as to why God shouldn't have used Rahab is because it's pretty obvious when we read the story. Rahab was a prostitute. She was not a pure woman by any means. In fact, if you look down there with me in Joshua chapter 2 and verse 1, it says that Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, "Go view the land, even Jericho." And they went and came into an harlot's house, that's a little milder language the King James Version uses, named Rahab, and lodged there. Now, I know over the years there have been those who have looked at this story, and they looked at the nature and the character of God, and they just find it impossible to reconcile in their minds how God could have used a woman like this to accomplish His will. And so what they do is they come up with a different definition of the word that's translated harlot in the Old Testament. And basically they'll tell you, well, that just means she was an innkeeper, because we just read that they lodged there, right? And so she wasn't a person that wasn't a pure woman, or she didn't have this tarnished reputation in her community. She was really just the manager of a motel. Well, that sounds pretty good. Well, it doesn't. The problem is this. While it is possible in the Old Testament, and even that word itself, to be translated a lodge keeper, and I have no doubt that that was part of her institution, the problem is this. When you go into the New Testament, you read in James chapter 2 about it, and you read in Hebrews chapter 11 about it, there's a Greek word that's used there that there's no doubt as to what that definition of that word is. And the definition of that word is a prostitute. She was a woman who sold her body for money. Did she own a lodging establishment too? Yes, she did, indicated, I think, by the scripture there. But there can be no doubt that she was engaged in some pretty seedy activities. And as you look at this, you have to, you ask the question, a lot of people just can't come to this grips. How could God use a woman of character like that? How could God have bought something good, or used somebody who is so evil and so wicked and so vile in the sight of men to bring about his purpose. You know, I was thinking about, as I was preparing this lesson, a story that's recorded for us in Luke chapter 7 about Jesus. Beginning at about verse 36, we read about how one of the Pharisees asked Jesus to come to his house and to eat with him. And he goes into the Pharisee's house and he sits down at meat. In verse 37 it says, "Behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment. And she stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and then wiped them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with oil. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner." Can you picture this event in your own mind? Here's a woman who enters into the house of this guest, or this man who has invited Jesus to be his guest. And pardon my frankness, but she's the town whore. And she walks in and she immediately begins draping herself on Jesus. What's going to go through your mind? Well, some pretty bad thoughts, right? Think about today, if a woman of that reputation, if a woman of that character entered into this church building, and we saw her and we knew her and we knew what her reputation was, how do you think we would react? I mean, do you think that we would be glad that she was here? Do you think that we would be excited that she had come into the church building today? If she immediately responded to the invitation, would we just include her in everything that we did? Would we invite her over to our house and say, "Hey, you want to come eat supper or lunch with us today? Or you want to come over to our house and study the Bible with us?" You know, I think all of us in some way, shape, or form could understand some of the difficulties that could be perceived from that situation. But what I want to emphasize is God uses this woman in a time, a woman of very questionable character, at a time when it wouldn't have been acceptable to do such. And even though God is working through this woman, which in and of itself would have been hard for chauvinistic culture to overcome, now it's a woman of irreputable character. And so the question becomes, how does God use somebody like that? Well, I don't know the history behind Rahab's situation. I'm not trying to justify what she did by any means. But I doubt there's very many women in life who, when they begin to start out, say, "This is my goal and my profession that I want to end up in." I think a lot of times it's economic hardships. It's things that come into the picture that kind of push these people toward this line of work, for lack of a better term. But I'm not trying to justify it in any way. I'm just saying I don't know all the background behind her story in and of itself. But I do know this. Because of what she was doing, there is not a person in that city who would have had any ounce of respect for her. There's not a person in that city who would have held her in high honor. There's not a person in that city who would have not considered her outside the edges of social acceptability. But when you stop and you think about, you read through the Bible, who are the type of people that God uses? It's those people who don't have honor among other people. It's those people who are on the edges or the outcasts of society. And so she's often, you think about it, she's really just the type of person that God used in a lot of difficult situations. The third thing, or fourth, I guess, we're on number 4 here. The fourth thing that I want us to think about why God shouldn't have used Rahab is because Rahab was dishonest when she was confronted with these men being in her house. You know, this is one of those debates that's probably been had among brethren over the years and probably will continue. I don't think there's a question about what the Bible teaches about lying. I think it's pretty straightforward, pretty cut and dry. But I also think this, are there some certain situations where deception was used and not necessarily condemned by God? I think if you're honest, you have to say yeah. Okay, and there's some questions that come to mind. First of all, understand this. This is not just like ordinary, everyday affairs. This is war. We're talking about a time of war here. If you were in a time of war, and you were a commander of an army, and you were captured by the enemy, and you were under torture, and these men tell you, reveal to us the position of your soldiers and all the supplies that they have, and we'll let you live. Would you say, well, I'm an honest individual, and so because I'm an honest person, I'll tell you exactly where they are, I'll tell you exactly how much they have, and you can go there and you can just wipe them out. Do we have an obligation to try to preserve life? I don't know. It's a good question, isn't it? But I think when you read through the Bible, one of the things you read about is there's some difficult situations and some difficult questions that you have to consider from time to time. I know what the Bible teaches about lying, about dishonesty, but let me ask you this. Should she have told these men the truth? Should she have put the lives of these servants of God in jeopardy? Should she have openly given them up into the hands of the king of Jericho? That's not my place to decide. God can work that out with her in the end. I'm not the judge, thankfully. But when we look at it, we see a dishonest person, don't we? And we see somebody who is not, God material, maybe for lack of a better term. You think about what Rahab did. Obviously, when you read in verse 2, and when the men come in the night to search for the children of Israel, in verse 3, Rahab says this. She says, I guess it's verse 4, there came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were. In verse 5, and it happened as the gate was being shut when it was dark, that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you might overtake them. It's not just that she twisted the truth a little bit. I mean, she just completely blew it out of the water, didn't she? She said, I didn't know who these men were. I didn't know where they came from. And I saw them run out of the city under the cover of darkness. You guys got to get with it. You got to pack it up and head out right now because you might be able to catch up with them if you do it. There's no way getting around it. She was dishonest, was she? She was a liar, is what we would say. But here's what I also want to emphasize. It's not her lying that made her useful in the eyes of God. In other words, when God was looking for somebody, He didn't look out and say, well, there's a liar, I can use her, she's a good one, She'll fall right in line with my line of thinking and the way I do things around here. That's not why God chose her. That's not what made her a useful instrument in the hand of God. Was she a perfect person? No. But was she a woman of faith? You know what the Bible tells us about her in Hebrews 11 and verse 31? It says, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Do you know why God used her? Because she was a woman of faith. She believed in this God of heaven. She believed in the cause of Israel. She believed Him to be Lord of heaven and of earth. Was she perfect in everything that she did and said? Absolutely not. She had her flaws. But then again, don't we all? We're all flawed beings in some sort and way who are working to do better and working to be better. And there's no question as you read on or think on about the life of Rahab, did she have to change her profession? Absolutely. Did she change her ethics? Did she have to make changes in those as she learned to live with the people of God? Certainly she did. But you know what I get out of this? God is able to transform the most unlikely and unusable of characters into somebody who is useful for Him. In fact, this woman was so useful to God that she's actually in the lineage of Christ. Do you understand that? In Matthew chapter 1 and verses 5 through 6, you read about the names of famous men and women who were part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. And you know whose name you read of in there? That's right, you read of Rahab. One of the most unusual choices to be in the lineage of Christ. She was not a Jew. She was a Canaanite. She was a woman. She wasn't a man. She was a prostitute, or she had some seedy things, some skeletons in her closets. Be a strange woman to choose to bring Jesus into the world, wouldn't it? She wasn't always truthful at times, no. But she settled down and she raised a family, and she was honored by God for her faith and for the type of person that she became by being placed as one of the physical people to bring Christ into this world. In James chapter 2, she's honored once again in the scripture by an example of works. There James says, likewise also was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she had received the messengers and had sent them out another way? The Bible says she's a great example of being saved by a working faith. It's outstanding evidence of God being able to work through anyone and transform anyone into the most useful and unlikely servants of His. You know, I mentioned this lesson. It's not really one of the normal things that I would probably spend a lot of time on, but I thought it was interesting, at least to me. I look at Rahab, and I can think of a lot of reasons why God shouldn't have used this woman. But the reality is, God did use this woman. And He used her in a very powerful way. And what does that do for me as an individual? For me, it's an inspiration. It's a story of hope, because it's a story about how God can take one of the most undeserving and one of the most unlikely of people to do something useful and great for Him. And then we think about, well, you shouldn't use people like that. Well, who are you going to use? Any of us perfect? Any of us haven't sinned? Any of us don't have skeletons in our closets from the past that we don't want other people to know about? It's not being perfect that makes us useful to God. It's just simply having faith and trust in Him, trying to live better lives, trying to be better people. And if we're willing to do that, we can be a useful servant of God. Not perfect by any means, flawed in our own way, but each men and women of faith trying to do better and working to do better. You know, I think of this story, and I always tell you guys, it's always, anything that I study is always personal to me. But I can think of 100 reasons today why I shouldn't be a preacher. I can think of 100 reasons why God shouldn't use me to accomplish His will and to spread His message. But then again, you look back through the history of God's Word, those are the type of people that God uses. Not people who are perfect. It's people who have flaws, have shortcomings, have insignificance in their own thinking and doing. But it's people who are trying to do better and be better people. And if we are those type of people, God can use us. He used Rahab to accomplish His will. He used Rahab to strengthen and encourage His people. He used Rahab to save others. We'll talk about that, Lord willing, more tonight. But the great encouragement that I get from this lesson is, if God can use a person like Rahab, He can use me. And He can use you too.